The smoke cleared from the great debate between Erasmus and Luther in 1525. And Erasmus and Luther went their separate ways. Erasmus did not want to stand fully behind the Pope, and he didn't want to join with the Lutherans either, the Protestants, evangelicals. He said, "I'm a heretic to both camps." And as a result, his program of reform, which aimed for a middle ground, was eroded by the controversy on both sides until finally it pretty well ceased to exist. Erasmus was very discouraged in the last part of his life, because what he found was that his criticism of the church, which he had written in order to reform the church, was now considered heresy, and his books were banned by the church. And this hurt him deeply. He spent the last part of his life in Basel, Switzerland, and he died there. He was working with Johann Froben at the press. Froben operated the printing press, and he was working with him at that time and was being paid. It was the first time in his life that he really had a salary, and so he was comfortable in that regard. On the other hand, Luther outlived Erasmus by about 10 years and went on preaching and teaching, even though he found himself under the emperor's ban. Were he ever to step outside of a territory that was controlled by a Protestant prince, he would be arrested and put to death, so he knew his limits. But he was able to write and to continue to teach, and he worked with Philip Melanchthon in Wittenberg. His house there was the former monastery at Wittenberg, and as the movement spread, and it spread quite rapidly, and more people left the Roman Church to take their stand with the Protestant Church, Luther's kitchen became the center of the Protestant universe. And the pastors from all over would come and sit around Luther's kitchen table and would talk to him and dialogue with him. His son wrote down what he remembered of his dad and the things he said and published it in a book called Table Talk, and it's a very interesting one to have. The Reformation spread throughout Germany, except for South Germany. It had gone into South Germany, but the peasants of South Germany felt that if they had been freed from the control of the Roman Church and freed from fear and freed from their sins through the work of Christ, that they should also be free from the mistreatment of their lords, their landlords. And when their landlords did not respond, and Luther had written urging them to treat their peasants correctly, justly, fairly, and they did not respond to Luther's encouragement, nor to the demands of the peasants took up arms against their landlords, and there was a revolt. This was also 1525, the same year as the debate with Erasmus. Now, Luther did not believe in violence. He absolutely did not. He once drove out his associate Andreas Karlstadt, told him to get out of Wittenberg, get out of his face. I don't want to ever see you again. Because Karlstadt had turned the movement into a violent one while he was in exile at the Wartburg when he was translating the Bible into German, the New Testament into German. And he threw him out of Wittenberg because he wanted to employ violence. Luther did not believe in violence. And so when the peasants rose up in rebellion, he wrote to them and criticized them severely for resorting to violence. But before his letter arrived there in South Germany, the landlords, both Catholic and Protestant, had joined together to put down this revolt in a great bloodbath, and thousands were killed. When the survivors received the letter from Luther denouncing them, they turned against Luther in great bitterness. And that is why today South Germany is Catholic. South Germany returned to the Catholic fold. And you go into Bavaria and those places today, and you will see the Catholic Church, not the Protestant Church. But the Protestant Church, the evangelical church, popularly known as Lutheran, began to spread throughout North Germany, Central Germany, and spread northward into Scandinavia, into Norway, and Denmark, and Sweden, and Finland, and Greenland, and Iceland. And the Lutheran Church became the state church of all of those countries and is to this day. And Lutheranism was adopted by the king in each of those countries. The king would consider that this is the true religion, and then he would announce that. And so you have, of course, a state church. While the spread of the evangelical church, which was begun by Luther, was occurring, there was a similar development in Switzerland. Now, Switzerland is a tiny country, mountainous country. It speaks 3 different languages. The people are fiercely independent and free. They love freedom. And they had just broken away from the German Empire. And there, in this environment of freedom, several of the pastors, if you please, if the priests of different churches, began to preach Reformed doctrines. Now you say, well, they were influenced by Luther. No, they weren't. There was no direct influence that we know of by Luther. As a matter of fact, in Zurich, which is the biggest city in Switzerland, Ulrich Zwingli, who had been appointed the minister of the large church there, the Grossmünster Church, began to preach the same doctrines actually about the time that Luther was first debating with John Eck at Leipzig, and before the great controversy of the Diet of Worms when he was brought before the emperor, and of course long before this controversy with Erasmus that we've talked about. Zwingli began to teach the same things. Now, Zwingli, who had studied at the University of Basel and the University of Vienna to be a Catholic priest, was an Erasmian humanist. But he changed. He gave up his Erasmian humanism to accept the doctrines of the Reformation. And it is interesting that not only was he a former humanist, but so also was Philip Melanchthon, who was a co-worker with Luther. And by the way, Philip Melanchthon is the author of the Lutheran Confession of Faith, which is the Augsburg Confession, which was written in 1530. So Philip Melanchthon was a former humanist, Ulrich Zwingli was a former humanist, and John Calvin was a former humanist. It is interesting that when humanists made the change, they brought something with them. And what they brought with them was a profound reverence for the text, because humanists believed in going back to the primary sources and studying those sources and learning from those sources. Now, I don't mean to say that Luther was not biblical and didn't ground everything in the Bible. What I'm saying is, let's turn up the intensity. From where Luther was with the Bible, turn up the intensity many notches. Because a humanist is going to be studying Scripture, digging into Scripture, trying to harmonize the apparent discrepancies, working out a systematic arrangement of theology. They're going to be very biblically based. The former humanists are going to be insisting that there be a clear Scripture for everything they teach. And they're going to do this far more than Luther. I'll just give you an example of that. Luther believed that whatever the Bible didn't forbid was okay. But these people who were former humanists said, you've got to find it in the Bible before it's okay, before it's right. And you see there's a difference in attitude there. And that's the way Zwingli was. And so Zwingli wanted a thoroughgoing, complete Reformation. A break with the Catholics in every regard. Taking very seriously the second commandment, you shall not make unto yourself any graven image. Removed all the images from the churches. Removed the organs from the churches. He denounced the idea of transubstantiation and went to the passage in Scripture where Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me, and said the communion is a memorial. It's a remembrance of Christ. And Zwingli began to preach these things in Zurich, Switzerland. And the church was reformed about 1523 in Zurich, Switzerland. But now there's a problem. We have really two different churches. And by the way, several other cities in Switzerland began to follow suit, like Lausanne, Geneva, Bern, Basel. All of these cities, it became Reformed cities, and each one had a minister who was a good Bible scholar. You could name several of them. Nicholas Kopp was one of them, and Wolfgang Capito, John Oecolampadius, William Farel, all over Switzerland. Now they're teaching the same thing. So essentially you have now a Swiss Reformed Church and you have this Evangelical Lutheran Church. You have two Protestant churches. And Martin Bucer, who was preaching at Strasbourg, thought we only should have one. Why should we be divided? We need to be one united Protestant church. And I know we've got some differences here, but we need to get together, find out what's essential, and unite on the essentials. Now there was not only that problem, but there is a political problem. Because you see, Switzerland, to the north of Switzerland, is South Germany, which is Catholic. And the south part of Switzerland had remained Catholic. Therefore, the Protestant cities that I just mentioned to you were sandwiched between layers of Catholics. And one particular German noble, a man named Philip of Hesse, realized they could put the squeeze on these Swiss cities and destroy them. So it would be better to unite with the Lutherans. Therefore, he got Luther and Zwingli together in a meeting in 1529 in Marburg at his castle. Now they had 14 points they differed on. They were able to settle very quickly 13 points. But there was one point they couldn't settle, and that was the communion. Because as I told you, Zwingli believed it was a memorial, but Luther believed that it is the body and blood of Christ. Very much like the Catholics. He didn't believe the priest changes it. He didn't believe in priests anymore. But he just says it is. I don't know how it is, but it is the body and blood of Christ. And they couldn't agree on that, so they split off, and we didn't have a united Protestant church. And perhaps that was a critical point, because had they united, maybe there would be today but one united Protestant church. John Calvin came to Geneva in 1536. And in that year, the council in Geneva voted to reform the church. There was a reformer already there named William Farel, and he asked Calvin to stay with him and work in Geneva. They worked for 2 years. They got kicked out because the more liberal, worldly element took over the city council, and they didn't like these strict preachers. But after 3 more years of having the liberal, worldly element in charge and having a wide open city, they changed their minds, and the more religious element took over the city council, and they invited the preachers back in 1541. And Calvin remained there the rest of his life. Now, what did Calvin believe? Well, he believed what Luther believed. He believed what Zwingli believed. All the reformers essentially believed the same thing. Calvin had a little different view about the Lord's Supper, a little different from Zwingli, a little different from Luther. He believed that it is basically a communion. That is, that Christ is with us in the Lord's Supper. What did Calvin contribute? Particularly, he contributed a book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion, because Calvin was determined to answer all the questions, to deal with everything, every aspect of theology, everything the Bible said, to deal with it. And because it was done so well, so systematically, so simply, so logically and consistently, Calvin's influence spread all over the world, and spread much more widely than Luther did. Luther's was pretty well geographically isolated in Germany and Scandinavia. But the Calvinism, the Reformed faith that we call Calvinism, spread everywhere. For instance, into Holland. And the church in Holland became the Reformed Church, the Dutch Reformed Church. Through John Knox, who came to Geneva to study with Calvin after Mary, Queen of Scots, kicked him out. He studied with Calvin, preached in Geneva, and then went back, managed to get rid of Mary, take over in Scotland, and the church in Scotland is the Reformed Church. Knox believed, and Calvin believed, that churches should be organized not under bishops, but under elders. And so the Greek word for elder being presbyteros, we have the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. In England, through a long process that we won't go into right now, the English church wound up with a Reformed creed. There were those in the English church who felt that they ought to stick very closely to that creed and make sure they purified the church. They became known as Puritans. So we have the Puritans, we have the Dutch Reformed, We have Presbyterians in Scotland. Calvinism spread into Austria, spread into Hungary, spread all over, and even came to the New World. So that many of the colonies that were established in what is now the United States began as Reformed colonies, particularly Massachusetts. But the Pilgrims, for instance, who came, were all Reformed people. Now, there were problems. The Reformed faith spread into France and was widely accepted there because Calvin himself came from France originally before he wound up in Switzerland. He came from a village near Paris. And so the Reformed faith spread into France to the point that the majority of the nobility became Reformed. And it spread and spread and spread. But the Queen, who was Catherine de' Medici, was a Catholic. And some of her advisors were radical Catholics. And the result was, in an attempt to stop the spread of Protestantism in France, in 1572, a massacre of the Protestants on St. Bartholomew's Day. However, when Catherine's son-in-law became king as Henry IV, he would allow, because he was a Protestant himself before he became king, he converted to Catholicism to save further violence, but he remained a Protestant in his heart. He allowed religious freedom in France by the Edict of Nantes in 1598. And from 1598 until Louis XIV unwisely revoked it in 1685, there was freedom of religion. And as long as these Reformed people were able to live in France freely, they benefited the French economy. Because you see, Reformed people believe that God calls us to whatever we're doing. And so whatever we do is a calling from God. Not only our salvation, but our occupation, if you please, is a calling from God. And so whatever you do to the glory of God. Now the Catholics didn't stress that. And the Protestants did. So whatever they were doing with all of their might, with all of the ability God gave them to the glory of God, and the result was the economy in France was booming. Louis made a bad mistake when he revoked the Edict of Nantes, and I think he paid for that. His successors did in the French Revolution. It was tough going in Holland for a while because Holland fell under the control of Spain. But eventually they gained their independence and the Dutch Church gained its independence. We come down one more generation. And as we come to this next generation, we're going to see one more expression of the controversy over the will. But I had to give you the information that I have so far just to kind of lead us up to that point. Augustine had his Pelagius. Luther had his Erasmus. Calvin was dead by the early years of the 17th century, but Calvinism had its Jacob Arminius. Now, Jacob Arminius was a pastor and a teacher in Holland in the Dutch Reformed Church. He taught in a university. And by the way, it happened that the people who became the Pilgrims, who came to America, were for a while living in Holland to escape persecution in England this time, under William Bradford. And they were at the same town at the same time that Arminius was there and were witness, Bradford and the others were witness to the debates that Arminius was having. Now that's just an interesting thing. They did not agree with Arminius. Now Jacob Arminius, like Erasmus and Pelagius, had a problem with the doctrine of predestination and with the limitation on the human will. It's just not fair of God to save some and not everybody, according to Jacob Arminius. That isn't fair. Of course, he, like most people who oppose the doctrine, believe that this might give rise to moral license. In any instance, he challenged the confession and the faith of the Reformed Church in Holland on 5 points. He challenged that election was unconditional. Now, he did not say, I don't believe in predestination. Arminius said, I do believe in predestination, but I don't believe it's unconditional. I believe it has something to do with us. He challenged the idea that the fall was complete. He challenged the idea that Jesus' atonement was specifically directed for the elect. He challenged the idea that God's call is effectual. He did not want to challenge the idea, if you're following the 5 points here, he did not want to challenge the idea that a person that is once truly saved can lose his salvation. He said, I cannot believe that. If God saves us, we certainly could not lose our salvation. Some of his friends said, but Jacob, if you have challenged on these other 4 points, there is no longer any basis for security. Now, what Arminius believed is simply this. He did believe that the fall was complete in the sense that when Adam sinned, he took the human race with him. He did believe that. He believed that as a result of Adam's sin, all mankind enters the world in a sinful state, unable to come to God. Their wills are corrupted by the fall. To that point, he and the Reformers would agree. Luther, Calvin, all the others would agree to that point. But, he said, God has extended what he called prevenient grace. Prevenient grace. That means he gives grace to everybody. As a result of Christ's sacrifice, everybody gets grace. And this prevenient grace that comes to everybody now enables everybody to choose to come to Christ or to choose to reject Christ. It's a doctrine of prevenient grace. So as far as predestination is concerned, what Arminius would say then is, God simply knew that you would accept Christ, and he then predestined you. And that's his view. So he did believe in original sin. He did believe in predestination. But he did believe that Jesus died for everybody. And he did believe you could resist the call of the gospel, the call of Christ on your heart. And he was forced to conclude, though he didn't want to, that once you were saved, you could lose your salvation. Now, those were his 5 points. They're not the 5 points of Calvinism originally. They're the 5 points of Jacob Arminius. But the church became concerned, and there were debates on this in the university. Now, this, in one sense, was not as spectacular as a debate between Luther and Erasmus, but it had very far-reaching consequences that come down to today. And in one sense, it's a continuation of the same debate that Luther and Erasmus had. It's a continuation to some degree of the same debate that Pelagius and Augustine had. So in the early years of the 17th century, the Dutch scholars, theologians, college professors, pastors, leaders of the church came together in a meeting at the Dutch town of Dort. And it's called the Synod of Dort. And they took each one of Arminius' 5 objections and they examined them in the light of Scripture. One by one. They took them and carefully looked at them. And when they finished, they said, on all 5 points, we find Arminius is in error. Because the Bible does not teach prevenient grace. The Bible does not teach that God gives a grace to everybody. The Bible teaches that the fall corrupts the will. And therefore, God must personally and individually call an individual to spiritual life. Now, of course, the result of that is what's been known by the acronym of TULIP, T-U-L-I-P, which has come to stand for total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. That, in some sense, could be stated better. But at any rate, those became the 5 points of Calvinism. They were really the reaffirming of the Reformed belief after examining the 5 objections of Arminius. Now, Arminianism was officially declared a heresy at the Synod of Dort, but it didn't completely die. It received a good deal of encouragement in the Enlightenment, because when the Enlightenment came along a few years later, beginning in the late 17th century into the 18th century, particularly by the mid-18th century, the Enlightenment emphasized human reason, the importance of man, and brought humanism back into the spotlight again. And so the Enlightenment scholars will pick up on Arminius' doctrine. And when you mix the Enlightenment idea of exalting human reason with Arminius' concepts, then you begin to see the effect it has upon the evangelical church. And gradually there was an effect of a liberalizing, of a weakening of the confessions of the evangelical church. One of the most significant scholars who embraced Arminianism was a man by the name of John Wesley. And John Wesley was the founder of the Methodist Church. A great scholar from England, from Oxford, who was a part of the Church of England. But he accepted the idea of Arminius. He had a great influence in America. His brother Charles Wesley was the one who wrote so many of the hymns that we all sing today. But Charles Wesley and George Whitefield, who was one of the great preachers in America, along with Jonathan Edwards, but particularly Whitefield and Charles Wesley dialogued until Charles Wesley came to affirm the Reformed faith and disagree with his brother in his heart, but he didn't want to cause a stir, so he didn't say much. But John Wesley continued to hold to the Arminian viewpoint and the idea of prevenient grace. When we come to America and you add in the Enlightenment and the idea of American democracy, and then the idea of Darwinianism and the theory of evolution in the middle of the 19th century, the effect was just enormous on the Protestant churches. And most of them that formerly had very strong evangelical confessions began to liberalize those confessions. Even the Baptists, who had been the bastions, who had been the stronghold of Reformed theology, Baptists had accepted fully the Reformed faith. They, of course, believed in adult baptism rather than infant baptism. But other than that, their confessions were Reformed, but even they began to change in the 19th century, to back off somewhat, although it seems that there is some movement today back toward affirmation of the Reformed faith. But you'll see liberalism coming into all the denominations. The Methodist Church becomes more liberal. The Presbyterian Church becomes more liberal in the 19th century. It's going to happen to all of them. And that brings us down to today. The point is, the conflict, the issue over the human will and God has ramifications. And historically speaking, when you accept the view that man's will can triumph over God, that in a contest between the will of God and the will of man, man's will win out, and that he can, out of his sin, choose God or not choose God, and can resist the grace of God. With this view that Erasmus and Arminius and the others advanced has consequences. And it will lead, historically, it has led to more and more liberal theology. In our next study, as we conclude, we will look at the concept of humanism from simply an ideological approach, a biblical approach, and have the history before us to kind of support what we're going to be saying in our next and our final study.